down. So we're going to look at Daniel 6 together. So if you've not got one of the Bibles or your own Bible to hand, perhaps you could just get that now and we'll look at it together and just share a few thoughts. I don't know what you'll be doing at 9 o'clock this evening. Don't know whether you'll be watching Downton Abbey. Hands up. If you're watching Downton Abbey. I don't know who'll be in bed. Anybody in bed by 9? Yeah, there's a few people. There's no shame in that, guys. It's a proper bedtime. Anybody watching Homeland tonight? So it's the first episode of the new series of Homeland. Oh, no one's a Homeland fan. That ruins my introduction, which is absolutely fine, because the only lead into it is that it's a very dramatic program full of sort of high drama, political thriller. And when we look at Daniel 6, it's high drama. It's a political thriller. And also at the beginning of each episode, and I expect tonight there'll be a longer introduction, you'll get the dulcet tones of Saul Berenson, or Mandy Patinkin, if you know who he is. He was in The Princess Bride. And he always says, previously on Homeland. And so when we look at Daniel 6, we want to put it into context and remember what's happened previously in the other 5 chapters. So if you just flick to Daniel 1, we're not going to look through them, but it'll just help us in our train of thought as we come to Daniel 6. So in Daniel 1, Daniel was a child taken. The Babylonians came in and they ransacked Israel, and then they took what they describe in verse 4 of chapter 1, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. I mean, if you got a CV with that on, you'd be very impressed, wouldn't you? Young man without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning. You know, I wonder if Daniel wrote that about himself, or whether it's somebody else writing that about Daniel, I don't know. But here we see that Daniel was a child taken from Israel, taken to Babylon, taken into the service of the king. And in chapter 1 with his friends, he stands out from the crowd and doesn't eat their food. He wants to remain pure. He wants to remain true to his God. And then in chapter 2, the king, Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream which he can't understand. And Daniel shows great insight. Him and his friends get together and they pray through the night to ask God to bring insight into this dream. And so Daniel is able to bring interpretation, and he's continued to find favor in the eyes of the king. Then in chapter 3, we have the account of not Daniel, but his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I remember Helen talking about shake the bed, make the bed, and to bed we go at a winter camp several years ago. These 3 friends of Daniel, who stand up, just as they did in chapter 1, stand up for what they believe, that they won't bow down to an idol of the king. They want to serve the true God. Then in chapter 4, Daniel comes back on the scene as Nebuchadnezzar has another dream, a dream which no one can bring interpretation to apart from Daniel. And he himself doesn't claim it to be his own, but claims that it is God speaking through him, God who has given him insight into this. And then chapter 5, that those of you here last week will have looked at it together. We see that the incident of King Belshazzar, who's the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and how he has this great feast, and then the finger of God appears and writes on the wall. And the message can't be understood by anyone apart from Daniel. And he is faithful to what God tells him. And we read at the end of that chapter that Belshazzar, what was written comes to pass. That it says, God has numbered the days of your reign. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then in verse 30 of chapter 5, that happens. Belshazzar is cast aside, their place is ransacked, and in comes Darius the Mede. And so we just have a little picture of a map of the kind of empire. It's not shaded very well, but if you can see the dotted lines, this was the Persian and the Medes. This was their empire at the time. So it was huge. And so that puts into context for us Daniel chapter 6 and the beginning as to why in government they had to appoint people to take charge of the different areas. You know, it wasn't enough for Darius to be able to know what was happening in each of these places. And so then Daniel comes, and Daniel is given the role of the administrator in verse 2. And it's important to consider that So Daniel was a young man in chapter 1, probably a teenager, whereas now in chapter 6, some 67 years have passed by. So now he's an older man. He's sort of 70, 80 years old. Perhaps we still hold in our heads that this is Daniel, the young upstart, standing up for God. But actually, this is Daniel, the old man, still standing up for God. And what do we learn in chapter 6 about who Daniel is and what he's like? Well, just look with me. So in verse 2, we're told that he was an administrator. In verse 3, we're told he wasn't just an administrator, but that he was the best administrator. He so distinguished himself among the administrators that he was going to be set above the whole kingdom, that actually the king trusted Daniel enough that he would allow him to have power over the whole kingdom. And then in verse 4, we read that Daniel was a man of integrity. We're told that the other administrators and the other government officials weren't happy that this man was going to prosper, which meant they were going to be under his rule. And so they sought to find a way to get him out, find a way to not have him have that influence. But they couldn't find a way. In verse 4, they could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. In the New Living Translation, it says that he was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So, maybe we read Daniel chapter 1 and think maybe he wrote that description about himself. These words here are the words of the people who are looking to kind of find fault in him. And yet they recognize and realize that there is no corruption in this man, that he is faithful, that he is responsible. And so when we consider Daniel and the den of lions, I want you to think about these people in the first instance being the lions. These people who are looking to destroy Daniel, who aren't happy with what he's doing, the fact that he's going to prosper. And throughout this, just like in Homeland, which has no cultural relevance for almost everybody in this room, is a power struggle at play throughout the whole of Daniel chapter 6. So the power struggle begins between the administrators and Daniel. They don't want Daniel to have power, so they set themselves to strip him of all that power. And so the next power game at play, which begins at the start of verse 6, the administrators go to the king. So they recognize that the king has power. But they think, actually, if 120 satraps and the other two administrators get together, we can convince the king to change his plans. We can convince the king to do something. So there's a power struggle at play. And as we look at verse 7 and to 9, we look at the proposal that the administrators put to the king, and it is all about power. It begins, "O King Darius, live forever." They're really massaging his ego as we go. The royal administrators, the prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed. So they're saying, look, there's this wealth of support behind what we're going to say to you. If we all agree, then surely that is what you will want too, O king. So then they say, for 30 days, no one should pray to any god or man except you. For someone in power, someone new to power in this area, they massage his ego by saying, live forever. They say, look at the wealth of support behind this proposal. And they say, this proposal is worship you. Put you as our God, our king God. And Darius thinks, well, that sounds like a good idea. Me, the king, maybe it's my rightful place that I should be worshipped and adored. And so the power struggle here is that Darius thinks, I want that power. I want that position in this society and in this community. I want people to worship me. And so Darius is kind of blinded by the words of these people, and he sets forth the little refrain at the end of verse 8, in accordance with the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And that crops up again and again, as Lucy and Hannah read to us, again and again, the laws of the Medes and the Persians that can't be repealed. And so Daniel learns of this. So Daniel's in a position of authority. He's the best administrator in the whole of the land, basically second, the right-hand man to the king. And what does he do? Well, it'd be easy to frame this as Daniel, the political activist. Daniel saying, well, if that's the law of the land, I'm going to go against it. I'm going to stand up against it. And although he does do that, it's not an act of protest. And the reason why I think it's not an act of protest, if you look with me in partway through verse 10, when we read about what Daniel did, he goes to his upstairs room where the window's open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God. So if we stop there, maybe we think, yes, it is a protest. This is someone who hears about this law and thinks it's not right, it's not just. God is the only person. But what I think is the key phrase is just as he had done before. Just as he had done before. This wasn't a man who was so shook up by the protest that he thought, my faith needs to make a difference now. Actually, in every single moment, from when he went to Babylon to these 67 years later, just as he had always done. You know, sometimes what I find most interesting about the Bible, not always, but sometimes, is what happens between the lines. What happens between the verses, between the chapters. You know, from Daniel 1 to Daniel 6, what's happening? Well, Daniel is a man who is faithful to God in every situation. Yes, we get the highlights, we get the best bits, and this is Daniel's little show reel. But actually, what was going on in between? Every day, 3 times a day, he got down and he prayed and he gave thanks to God. So the act of protest, it wasn't, oh, I'm so angry about this that I'm going to do the other. It was actually, this is just what I do. This is who I am, what I believe. This is the rhythm of my life. And so Daniel prays and he gets caught out. The people go to watch him. And they see, because they know, when they said earlier, there's no fault in him. The only fault that we could possibly find is maybe about his religion. Because they knew as well. It wasn't just, Daniel did it in private, we're told, in his own room. But this was a faith that was lived out for all and everybody else to see. Because they know they could catch him out in this way. And so when he thinks no one else is watching, Daniel keeps his rhythm and continues to pray. And so then the power struggle comes back. They think, right, we've got him. We'll go back to the king. Sort of these dirty dealings from the administrators and the satrap. Say, king, look, you said this. The Medes and the Persians' laws can't be repealed. You have to stick by it. And the king goes, right, okay, I will. And so the administrator says, well, Daniel's praying 3 times a day. Not to you, but to his God. And then we read in verse 14 that the king heard this, was greatly distressed, and he determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. So the power struggle was in kind of full flow now. The king thinks, well, I've made a bad decision, and I want to save Daniel. So he's trying to use his power for good now to save Daniel. But then he realizes there's nothing that he can do. And the other administrators, they're baying for Daniel's blood. And they come back to him at the end of the day. You can imagine they were waiting almost behind the door of the palace, waiting for the sun to reach the horizon and set, because they want to go in there and get Daniel thrown into the lions. So then they go in, and the king says, well, I have to, again, because of the laws of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict from the king can be changed. So the king gave the order, we're told in verse 16. And here we have the real power that is at work in this chapter and throughout the book of Daniel and throughout the Bible. The king offers these words to Daniel as he's thrown into the lions. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. The king's power was limited. The king had got himself in a situation that he couldn't get out of. Despite the fact he didn't want Daniel to go to the den, the king couldn't do anything about it. And now this king, this foreigner, this ruler of great lands in Persia and elsewhere, he says, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And so then the drama plays out. Daniel's thrown in to the lion's den, and it's sealed with the signet rings of the kings and his nobles, so then they can see if anybody had snuck in. You know, like in James Bond and in Bourne Identity, often puts a little bit of sellotape over his door when he goes out. And then he comes back, maybe it's not sellotape, maybe it's something more high-tech. He puts a sellotape over his door, And then he comes back in and he sees if the sellotape's broken when he goes there. Oh, someone's in there. And so that's basically all that's happening here, is they're putting the seal round the stone. So if they go back in the morning and the seal's broken, they know someone's been in there and someone's done something untoward in this case. So the king sets the seal and leaves Daniel to it. And we're told he shows remorse, shows repentance. No food, no drink, no entertainment, no sleep. And then at sunrise. So just as the administrators were waiting for sunset to go and pounce on Daniel to get him thrown in the lion's den, the king at sunrise, as soon as it's ready, as soon as it's time, to go and see if Daniel has survived. So he comes near the den in verse 20. He called out Daniel in an anguished voice, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions?" Daniel answered, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lion. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I done any wrong before you, O king." So the power at work now is God Almighty, God, the everlasting God. And Daniel recognized that actually it's before God that is the most important. He says, God recognized that I had done nothing wrong, and then also I'd done nothing wrong before you. But what was most important to Daniel? The God that he prayed to 3 times a day for 67 years and grew in relationship and stood up to him. It was him that mattered most to Daniel, not the king. So God had found that Daniel was innocent in his sight, and also knew that he was innocent in the sight of the king, and saved him. So the king then lists him out, and there's great joy and there's rejoicing. And then we have almost an awkward moment that it would be easy to not look at and not to consider, when the people who had accused Daniel, so whether it was just the 2 administrators or whether it was the whole satraps and the administrators, so the 122 people, and their wives and their children were thrown in to the lion's den. And before they reached the floor of the den, it tells us in verse 24, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. It would be easy for the writer of Daniel to have left that out, to have left out this kind of gruesome end for these people who had been trying to get the power, remove Daniel from power. And so why is this included? I think in the first respect, this was the law of the time. This is what it was like in Persia. You know, in the Bible, the writer doesn't say God approved of this. It doesn't say this is what God wanted. This was the rule of the land at that time. This would have been seen as justice. Justice of the land, not necessarily justice of God, and there is a difference. And so these men, women, and their children are thrown to their death. And although the circumstances weren't necessarily of God's choice and choosing, through those circumstances, he shows, therefore, his own power in saving Daniel, in closing the mouths of the lion, in sending his angel to close the mouths of the lions. So the power at work in these chapters, we have the administrators struggling for power, the king wanting power for himself, and we have God at work in his power, in the situation, to show that he is the living God. Darius, when he sees what's happened, so Daniel saved, the others thrown to their death, he realizes for himself, and that nation, that map of the kingdom that we saw at the beginning, he sends this letter from verse 25. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So what is at work in Daniel 6? It's an expression of God's power at work in that situation. And Darius himself recognizes that God is a living God, a God who's able to do incredible things, things that go beyond human comprehension, that God is a God over nature as well as a god over other things, over the beasts of the fields. And just as we sort of tie up these thoughts together, just to encourage you to think of two lions that occur later on in the New Testament, so after the life of Daniel. And the first line is in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verses 8 and 9. And the first part of the verse is just on the screen. So 1 Peter 5. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy the devil prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kinds of sufferings. So the lion that Peter describes is the devil himself, at work in the world and at work in situations, just like the devil was at work in the satraps and administrators, looking to see someone who is standing up for God devoured, destroyed, stripped of anything. And yet you could almost read verse 9 in 1 Peter for Daniel, that Daniel resisted the devil, standing firm in his faith. What marked out Daniel was his rhythm of prayer and his intimacy with God through prayer. And the devil, what he wants to do is to strip people of that intimacy. He wants people to be devoured, left in such a state from a lion attack that they can't move and they're wounded. And it's not physical. You know, the devil's not going to get a lion. You're not going to walk down Aspley Lane from here, you'll be glad to know. And the lion's not going to jump out and attack you and rip you from limb to limb. But the devil will maybe use different situations, people, circumstances, to separate you from God. That's what he wants to do. That's what he was at work in Daniel 6 trying to do. He thought, Daniel, yeah, he prays, but he doesn't know God. He won't stand up for God. And yet Daniel stood firm in his faith. He resisted the devil. And when we think of the devil's power, we need to remember the other lion that is described in the New Testament. And this one's in Revelation 5 and verse 5. And so the book of Revelation is written by John, one of the disciples of Jesus, and he has great visions of what's to come and what will happen. And in verse 5, we have this situation where a scroll appears, and no one is found in the whole of heaven and earth who could open the seal of this scroll. No one is worthy. Until in verse 5, one of the elders said to John, "Don't weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. This is Jesus Christ, the Lion of Judah, the Root of David, who has triumphed. We remembered at the breaking of bread that Jesus died on the cross, and yet he rose again. Jesus was thrown not into a lion's den, but was thrown into a tomb. A stone was rolled in front of it, and although they didn't put their seals on it, they put 2 guards, 2 Roman guards, outside to make sure that nobody could mess with the body, so that the disciples and their conspiracy theory couldn't take the body out and say, Jesus is alive. But as we read the accounts in the gospel, when at sunrise, so just as at sunrise King Darius went to see Daniel, at sunrise Mary and the other women went to the tomb to see, is it true? Is it possible? Is this the living God? And what do they find? That the Romans are left in a daze and the soldiers are on the floor not knowing what's happened. The stone is rolled away and there's an angel sat atop it saying, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" Jesus Christ, living, risen, the Lamb of God, the Lion of Judah. And so our challenge, and my challenge to myself and my challenge to you from this moment is which lion are you going to choose to stand with? Are you going to allow the lion, the roaring lion who looks to devour? Are you going to let him stop you from relationship with God? Or are you going to say, I believe in the Lion? I've forgotten how the phrase goes now. The Lion of Judah. Are you going to believe in the Lion of Judah? That he has triumphed over the schemes of the devil. The grave couldn't hold Jesus, and the lies which the devil seeks to devour us with and bind us with and make us feel guilty so we can't be in relationship with God. Are you going to let those things stop you? Or are you going to say, Jesus has broken every chain, every guilt, all the guilt that I feel, all of the regrets that I have, nothing can stop you and separate you from life with Jesus. You know, Daniel is an example to us as a young man and is an example to us as an old man. And so, regardless of how old you are this morning, Daniel is an example to each and every single one of us. A man of faith, a man who served God continually, 3 times a day. I think it is easy to think about the lives of teenagers and how things are difficult. But teenagers and children, I've got some bad news for you. It's that it doesn't get any easier. You know, each and one, if you look around and look at each of the people around here, they'll tell you that the Christian faith doesn't get easier. The challenges don't get any easier. The devil still looks to devour us. And yet the Lion, the tribe of Judah, has triumphed.